Hello and welcome to East Castle Place's weekly Bible study. I am Chaplain Harold Epley and I'm glad you've joined with me today. We are going to continue with our devotions using the book Dancing in the Aisle, Spiritual Lessons We Have Learned from Children, book written by my wife Rochelle Melander and myself a number of years ago. And each week we look at a story about a child. In this case, this week we're going to be looking at a little older child, a teenager. But stories about things that children have done, experiences they have had, and then looking at what the spiritual lesson is in that for us as adults. And we always tie that in with a scripture reading and some discussion questions for you to reflect on throughout the week. And today's topic is entitled, The Faithful Servant. And this is a story about a remarkable young man who really left a huge impact on both my wife and myself, as you will hear when I read the story later. But the theme, the faithful servant, is about how the little things we do in life are so very important. And sometimes we look at the big steps, but we're reminded that big steps involve a lot of little steps along the way. And that's a theme that we do see in the scriptures quite a bit, that everything we do matters, and things that we might often overlook in life. And of course, sometimes things that children do are things we overlook. But we're always building one step after another. It's like that, a journey of 1,000 miles begins with a single step. That's sort of the theme we're working with today. Our scripture reading is one maybe you are familiar with. It is from the Gospel of John. I'm going to be reading today from chapter 6, verses 1 through 14. And this is a story commonly called the story of the feeding of the 5,000. It's one of Jesus' miracle stories where there are people, a huge crowd of people all gathered together, and they've been listening to Jesus speak to them, and now they're hungry and it's time to eat. And they don't have enough food. But what's interesting about this story is there's a minor character who's actually a child. There's a very brief reference to him in this story. And he does something that seems to be pretty small that ends up being something very big. And so if you want to follow along, I'm reading from the New Revised Standard Version, but this is John chapter 6, verses 1 through 14. Now after this, Jesus went to the other side of the Sea of Galilee, which is also called the Sea of Tiberias. A large crowd kept following him because they saw the signs that he was doing for the sick. Jesus went up the mountain and sat down there with his disciples. Now the Passover, the festival of the Jews, was near. When he looked up and saw a large crowd coming toward him, Jesus said to Philip, "Where are we to buy bread for these people to eat?" He said this to test him, for he himself knew what he was going to do. Philip answered him, 6 months' wages would not buy enough bread for each of them to get a little. One of his disciples, Andrew, Simon Peter's brother, said to him, "There is a boy here who has 5 barley loaves and 2 fish. But what are they among so many people?" Jesus said, "Make the people sit down." Now there was a great deal of grass in the place, so they sat down, about 5,000 in all. Then Jesus took the loaves, and when he had given thanks, he distributed them to those who were seated. So also the fish, as much as they wanted. When they were satisfied, he told his disciples, "Gather up the fragments left over so that nothing may be lost." So they gathered them up, and from the fragments of the 5 barley loaves left by those who had eaten, they filled 12 baskets. When the people saw the sign that he had done, they began to say, "This is indeed the prophet who is to come into the world." Okay, a great miracle story, but hopefully you caught that part about the boy here who just has some bread and fish, not very much, maybe just enough for him to eat or a few other people to eat, and from that little gift that he gives, Jesus works this tremendous miracle. So think of that theme as you're thinking about your own life and the little things in life and how important they can be. And here's this story of a man, or a young boy, a young man, I should say, he's 15 years old, whose name was Kenny, the faithful servant. Kenny was born with Down syndrome. When we met him, he was 15 years old and had the mental age of a 6-year-old. He attended high school and worked at a center for developmentally disabled people. He had a girlfriend, and he was one of the pillars of the church. Every Sunday, Kenny sat at a table in the narthex and greeted people as they came in for worship. Those of us who knew Kenny well could see the hope in his eyes. He wanted to carry the cross in the weekly procession. If he could have done it every week, he would have. Instead, he had to wait until his name came up in the regular rotation. Fortunately for Kenny, many of the other teenage cross bearers were not as dedicated. And when they forgot to show up, he was always ready to step in. 2 years after we first met Kenny, he died of a cardiac arrest. Heart problems are common among adults with Down syndrome. Knowing that did not ease the pain. We missed seeing Kenny when we entered church every Sunday. We missed his warm greetings. The children missed having him sit with them at the children's sermon. The entire congregation missed seeing him carry the cross and assisting with the service. The first year after his death, not a Sunday went by that someone didn't say, "Oh, how I miss Kenny." Sometimes, in reading the stories of saints and other devoted Christians, we may wonder, how could anyone be so utterly faithful? Catherine of Siena took her dissatisfaction with the abuses in the church so seriously that she wrote to the Pope, persuading him to make changes. Dietrich Bonhoeffer died for his efforts to oppose the Nazis. Martin Luther King Jr. was killed for his work to bring equality to all people. The prolific accomplishments of leaders like these are so extraordinary that their lives sometimes function as an unrealistic measure for our own. We may look at their example and say, "I could never do that." We may read their stories and sigh, wondering how anyone could find the vision and courage to accomplish so much in a lifetime. And yet, our Christian life is not a competition to discover who can do the best job of following Jesus. It is a journey. Throughout our daily walk with Jesus, the challenge is to be faithful. Jesus commands his disciples, "If any want to become my followers, let them deny themselves and take up their cross daily and follow me." That's from Luke chapter 9, verse 23. Jesus does not require tremendous acts of devotion. He simply asks his followers to choose each day to follow him. And so the Christian journey is made up most often of tiny steps rather than great strides. With our small acts of faithfulness, Jesus can weave a beautiful life that witnesses to God's love. It is like the miracle story recorded in John's Gospel, in which Jesus feeds more than 5,000 people. The crowds were hungry, and the disciples were doubtful. They didn't know where they would find enough bread to feed everyone. Andrew said, "There is a boy here. who has 5 barley loaves and 2 fish. But what are they among so many people?" Jesus took the boy's food, and with it he fed the whole crowd. Looking at the boy's offering, Andrew remarked how paltry it seemed in comparison to what they needed. And yet, small as the offering was, Jesus was able to make it enough. More than enough. In our own lives, we might think that our offerings are inadequate. But that is not our worry. We are called to use our gifts to serve. We do this in many ways, some small and unseen, others very visible. Neither should we spend time fretting about what God might do with our gifts. Our task is to share our lunch, to give of ourselves faithfully day by day. Kenny's life was a testimony to how choosing to be faithful in small ways leaves behind a great witness to Jesus. Kenny didn't discover a cure for cancer or write a theological treatise. He carried the cross into church on Sunday. He greeted people. He stood in front of the congregation listening eagerly to the children's sermon. In many little ways, Kenny was faithful, and in doing so, he obeyed Jesus' command to take up his cross and follow. On the Sunday after Kenny's death, we used the children's sermon time to talk about his life. We remembered the things that we loved about him. We considered the many ways that he had pointed us to Jesus. And then we decided to thank God for the most precious gift of Kenny, another Christian who shared our path for too brief a time. The whole congregation sang in unison, so loud that even those sleeping across the street could hear the words of the popular hymn, "Lift High the Cross." As I said, Kenny is a young man who we will always remember. He passed away many years ago, and yet his story is told in this book, and he's somebody that my wife and I think of very often. Simple things he did that left such a great impact on our lives and on the lives of all who knew him. So that gives us something to think about. What ways are you affecting people's lives by the little things you do? Who are the people in your life who have made a big difference to you? Not because of some big thing they did, but just those little, simple, everyday things. We talk in here about how being a Christian is really a call to walk faithfully following Jesus, carrying the cross, as he says, every day. It's just about simply being faithful in little ways. We fall short sometimes, but God is there to cover us when we make mistakes and to forgive us and help us to continue on our journey. So, some questions for you to think about. Reflect on some examples of God's working great things from someone's small yet faithful actions. I'm sure if you give it some thought, you can realize that something that might have started small that turned into something big. And you know, everything that's big did start as something small. You think about that, the great movements that happen in life, the changes that come across in society like we're seeing now, start with little things that become big things. So reflect on that theme. Second question for you, in what ways do you faithfully serve God and others? Take a look at your own life and those little things that you try to do every day to make a difference. The third question, what are some of the small ways in which you could be serving God and others that perhaps you've been overlooking? So again, this involves doing a little bit of self-examination. You know, there are always things that we could be doing that we aren't, right? And we don't have to become obsessed with that because there's always more we could do, right? But maybe there are some opportunities for you, and it could be something that doesn't take a whole lot of time. Maybe it's just praying for somebody a little bit more often, or just a little simple hello to somebody that you pass in the hallway, or even somebody a call on the phone. Sometimes we overlook opportunities that are right there in front of us to do things that can make a big difference in other people's lives. So that's our theme for today, little things making a big difference. And we thank Kenny for his example and his wonderful story. I'll be back again next week with another story from Dancing in the Aisle, another Bible reflection. Hope you have a wonderful week, and may God bless you.